I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, who really doesn't, in this crowd, doesn't need much of an introduction. It's Rich Batiuk. And so Rich is the Associate Director for Science Analysis and Implementation at the U.S. EPA Chesapeake Bay Program Office in Annapolis. In his 33 years with the EPA and the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, he has led the integration of science into multi-partner policy making and collaborative decision making. Rich is now focused on directing the partnership resources towards helping local partners understand their part in the Bay and watershed restoration efforts and getting the job done, restoring water quality to local waterways in the Bay. And I should say that unfortunately, I guess fortunately for Rich, he's retiring soon, I think very soon, like this next month or something. So we're kind of sad to see him retire, but I think he's maybe pretty happy about it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rich.
So I didn't want to stay around as long as Don Bosch has been here. You know, he welcomed John Smith here to the Chesapeake, and he lived a little bit longer than him as well. But I figured it'd be time to exit left while the Bay is actually improving out there before something else happens. So as always, guys, I had to use 2 slides to put my title up there, but I crammed it on one with a smaller font in there. But I wanted to, they made the mistake of saying, Rich, you've got the opportunity to talk about anything you want to up there. So I wanted to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is how we take science here in this collaborative partnership itself, and how do we put it to good use. And to do that, I wanted to take you through really 2 case studies that really span the past 30 plus years of the partnership as well out there. But one of the things that I want to also put up here is not only the Wawa logo that you see up there, but I want to emphasize down below there 3 words that I think really embody this partnership from the 1980s. And that is, on one side you see science, the other side you see partnership, in the middle you see restoration. And it's not a cliche or whatever, but this partnership has truly done that, and that is, it has gotten bigger and bigger in terms of who's at the table on one side, and it has truly used that science. Some cases, not as quickly as we'd like to see out there, but as you'll see in the 2 examples that I want to take behind the scenes, I think quite effectively. And in the policy framework of how the partnership works, it actually invites the science in there. In fact, it demands the science to come in. But there's also times that it shuts it down and says, hey, listen, I need to make some policy decisions, I need to move on, but you're going to have another opportunity where I'm going to open the doors up, I'm going to invite the science in, going to lock it down, and then I'm going to move forward on it as well. So I'd like to take you through that to give you 2 examples. But I think one of the reasons we're able to do that, and this goes back to the 1983 Chesapeake Bay Agreement, and those agreements over time, and I'm going to show you the timeline in a minute here, have gotten more complex and have demanded more of the science, they've demanded more policy, they demanded more of us in terms of us humans making changes out there. But we've used those to guide the restoration, to get above local, state, federal elections out there, to go across parties, etc., to bind us collectively across 6 states in the district, 64,000 square miles, and now 18 million of us watershed residents, towards what we're going to do in an agreement to how we're going to move forward on that. Those agreements, as I want to show you, have not only invited the science in, but have demanded it come in, and the science in turn has pushed those agreements beyond what we say out there as well. But one of the differences as well here in the Chesapeake Bay region, that we sort of separated ourselves apart from other parts of the country and even around the world. And that is, we set goals, we set quantitative ones, but we also committed to tracking progress, even if the news was not good out there. No fake news. Even if the news wasn't good out there, we laid it out there. And then over time, our agreements reflected the changes in those goals, the evolution of it, the new science that came in there as well. So as you're going to see periodically, over time, new agreements come in there, they embody that new set of science, they expand the restoration efforts in there, they get more quantitative, they get more specific in there, they go beyond just that focus on water quality, fish, crabs, and oysters, to include diversity, to include land conservation, to include education out there as well, knowing that those are critical to bring back local parts of the system that bring back the ecosystem itself. But it's that sense of agreements, that sense of I've got to measure what's happening out there, I've got to be accountable, that is also drawing the science in there. So there's a science not just in the one traditionally you think about, but the social and human sciences get factored in here as well. So here's it in a nutshell, the 50-plus year history. So we actually go back in the 1960s time period when the Chesapeake was starting to crash. We were losing grasses out there. We were discovering this dead zone across the bay system out there. Our Bay Foundation colleagues had an early start out there as well. And then there was a study under the Reagan administration that actually started up the Chesapeake Bay program to understand what the ills were of that. The Chesapeake Bay Commission got started. But if think about one of those, that book out there in terms of the Da Vinci Code. So if you look at these ones, you're not going to find any magical code in here, but if you look over time, you'll see a first Chesapeake Bay Agreement in 1983, 87, 2000 Bay Agreement, and then most recently, 2014, a Bay Watershed Agreement. But if you look in there, there's about a 5 to 7 year time period between when we set an agreement, when we set policy, and then there's an effort to implement, to get things done, and then move forward from there. So let me see if I can walk you through a couple examples of that. If you look at the 87 agreement, the next big one was in 92. 5 years later, the next piece was a reevaluation in 1997 with the tributary strategies. And then you go up about 7 years to when the EPA worked with the 6 states to adopt water quality standards. And then you go on to the TMDL about 5 years later. 7 years to the interim target of what we call the midpoint assessment in 2017. And then 7 years later in 2025. Was it purposely done at the beginning? Absolutely not. I think there was a time period in which policies were made, agreements were put in place, work was done, and then sort of not that we exhausted the science of the data, but we got to a point where it said, hey listen, we've not enough, we've got these new insights coming along, we need to reopen this as well. That allowed us, as you'll see in the cycle of how we've updated models, how we've moved our monitoring system, how we've also driven our science as well over time. So keep that 5 to 7 year time period involved. The key thing is the policymakers, when I say that up to the governor's level, the state secretaries, their federal counterparts, were amenable to then saying, I'm willing to change. The numbers can change, my goals can change, but then I need stability in which then I can talk to the public, I can talk to watermen, I can talk to local elected officials and move that forward as well. But that 5 to 7 year time period allowed and sort of got us on the system of time to bring the science in, time to upgrade our thinking, be adaptive, work it through as well. So first we want to take you behind the scenes on something that doesn't seem as critical, but in this particular case, it's from a regulatory standpoint, can we define what a clean Chesapeake Bay is? Not in terms of ecosystem processes, but from a water quality perspective. And we did something here that still nowhere else in the country is done, and that is we got 6 states in the District of Columbia agreeing on a shared body of water, what is a clean Chesapeake Bay. We got them to agree to the science behind those, and they built it into state regulations. So it is a law that in Maryland, Virginia, DC, and Delaware, those states are committed to provide the public certain quality of water in terms of oxygen, clarity of those waters, the quality of the algae out there, underwater grasses. Nowhere else, whether it's the Great Lakes, the Gulf of Mexico, Tampa Bay, etc., have they had multiple states agree on collectively, even upstream states like New York, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, they were at the table as well, and I want to walk you through that as well. So here's a quick snapshot of how that all fit together. What you'll notice is it's a decadal scale piece. We started actually in 1986 to 91 time period, bringing hundreds of scientists together to talk about what is the habitat requirement for rockfish, whether she's a spawner or she's a newly hatched egg out there as well. What about those underwater grasses, 24 different species? Do they have different requirements? Do we have to do something for gizzard shad or for American shad or hickory shad? Do they have different requirements? So we started really from a base of talking to fishery scientists, to underwater grass scientists and others of saying, what is the need of those critters out there? We went through a process in the 90s and 2000 that Bill Dennison, myself, Bob Orth, and others remember well, and that is a series of syntheses, or where we drew together the available science on underwater grasses. We put together conceptual models. We challenged ourselves in saying, was it just cloudy waters or was something else in there as well? It was a lead up on the scientific side until 2000 time period when the politics were right. In other words, we were at the point where we had voluntary efforts, they weren't working the way that we wanted to. We needed to drive water quality to the next level. How to do that? In the Clean Water Act, one of the basic components is defining clean water out there. But we had to do it across 6 states in the district. We had to do it for 4 jurisdictions that shared tidal waters as well. So one of the things that we ended up moving forward with is, with that Chesapeake 2000 agreement, the language included the following. Again, nowhere else in the country for a multi-state partnership. First, the governors and the mayor, the EPA administrator said, hey, listen, we want you in 2001 to define the water quality conditions necessary to protect aquatic life. That seems pretty simple and straightforward. You're talking about a $25 billion set of decisions there. You're talking about upgrading treatment plants up in Oswego, New York, what somebody does in their backyard in Hampton Roads, what a farmer does on the Delmarva Peninsula out there in terms of that. And the second one is as well, again, first time across the country, and that is 6 states, the district, you guys are going to work together, you're going to work with EPA, and you're actually going to put a consistent set of water quality standards in place. Previous to that, if you were a rockfish, you talk with a southern accent as you're coming in through, down there in the Hampton Roads area through Virginia. You start to talk like somebody in Baltimore called people hun when you came into the Potomac River, because that's, and then you were going up into DC's waters up there to spawn. You had 3 different requirements out there. In Virginia, a little bit less requirement. Maryland, somewhat. DC, a little bit more stringent. You were a mother rockfish, you were kind of pissed off because you had about 1 million kids in there that are just waiting to get out of there. Your habitat requirements didn't change when you came to that ocean up into DC waters. But when you're in DC and you're spawning, you actually needed a little bit extra protection, because when those kids got out there, they only had this little shell around them sitting there floating around. They needed extra protection. That wasn't the case until the governors, the mayor, the administrator said, we need to ask the fish what the requirements are. So in this particular case, in 2003, we actually put together, for the first time in my agency usually had 2 or 3 scientists, a contractor, that would actually write a water quality standards document. Lee Curry, this is for you in the back there, since you came in late there, buddy. Can you see the fine print here? This is 4 pages of acknowledgments in an EPA criteria document that lists hundreds of scientists. There's a bunch of guys in here that your name is up in here. Unprecedented. We had regulated community, we had advocacy folks, we had scientists there, we had managers that were creating essentially the definition of a clean Chesapeake Bay. It had to be regulatorily sound, it had to be so that you could explain to your neighbor, that you could explain to your local elected official as well. But then we went through a process, again, unprecedented, where Maryland, Virginia, DC, and Delaware actually adopted into regulation the science that we in the community put together. And then there's been a process where usually a standard gets put in place. It's like you brought down the tablets from the Temple Mount, and that was it, guys. That standard's in place for the next 25 years. We said, no, the science evolves. So we actually amended, some cases, the state standards to reflect new science as it went through. Again, something unique to this partnership. But then that science also down on your lower left-hand column started to say, hey, listen, you see that red down there? That said when we put those standards in place, there's a lot of Chesapeake Bay waters out there that are impaired. That needs to be the driver that says, here's where we want to get, yet you use our models to determine how much we need to pull from that bay pollution diet across those 6 states. It ended up in a Chesapeake Bay TMDL, and over the last 10 years, a phase 1, a phase 2, and now actually a phase 3 watershed implementation plan. So you essentially went from habitat requirements, a collective sense from the scientific community of what rockfish, crabs, oysters, whole species of fish, others, into a regulated community, into locally driven state responsibility set of plans out there as well. So let's walk through a little bit more of the science in there. One of the key pieces in the Clean Water Act is designated uses. What do you want to get there? So it's fishable, swimmable. So if John Wolf and I go out there, he catches a rockfish and I don't, is it fishable? I don't think it is, because he was the one that caught the fish. We needed to be sure that in fact across Maryland, Virginia, DC, and Delaware, you didn't see a political boundary, but you saw a thermocline or picnic line, you saw a depth change as well. So what we went, essentially, we went back into the Chesapeake, we talked with scientists, with those physical oceanographers. They're actually pretty reasonable guys and gals out there. The biologists, fisheries folks, benthic ecologists, and said, how would we split up the Chesapeake? What is the science? What are the fisheries telling us? Here's what they did, both in terms of and vertical, horizontal, and through time. But we also had to make it simplified. We had to say, hey, this map of the Chesapeake's like a local zoning map. You have a commercial district over here, multiple housing over here. We want to keep this in farmland. We kept the same thing. During a certain time period, we had shad, herring, perch, rockfish spawning. Different habitat, different time of the year. You go down deep. It's where the lawyers live, down in those, are there any lawyers in the room here? Mudsuck, oh, sorry guys. Down to where the crab food is down there. Right now it's got zero oxygen. We needed to bring it back in there as well. This made sense to folks. The watermen were working the picnic line because they know where that was out there, and that was influencing the fish food, etc. And our fisheries folks said, hey, listen, here's where you need to work that in there. We needed to then get this into standards, so this became a regulation. Again, first time that a body of water interstate was not separated by jurisdictional boundaries, it was separated by biological and physical boundaries. An example, migratory spawning in nursery areas. This is actually encoded into Maryland, Virginia, and DC and Delaware's regulations that say during a certain time period, these waters are have a higher need for better water quality because you have more sensitive species occurring in these systems as well. So these maps are built into state law essentially out there, and this is how we're working. A tremendous amount of science that went into defining those boundaries out there as well. One of the things you might look at and say, so the Chesapeake goes back and forth. One of the key things is we had to look at this system, and that is we had to define open water habitats where there's rockfish in there, deep water below the picnic or within the picnic line area where you start to see less oxygen. You had to have a different set of mixing in those deep channel areas, both the physical boundaries, etc. We had to depend on people like Tom Fisher and others to actually publish in the scientific literature how we would define those boundaries out there, because they actually, in the state standards, they move with time. They're not set in stone, and people that get regulated don't like that. They said, wait, the boundary moves? You're right, that system moves. We want to be sure that we're asking of those different levels, those different parts of those habitat, what that science was indicating that we needed to protect in time. So you look at this one, again, there was a team of scientists, managers, and our advocacy community and regulated folks that actually sat down and over a 2 to 3 year period came up with a set of numbers. The problem is, but a 1 milligram per liter change in what the science would indicate could be billions of dollars. Or it could be to the point where if you said, hey, listen, down here, those worms and clams, they need 2 milligrams per liter. Well, we probably saw that when John Smith was here. We have it 0 now. It's actually starting to come up in the Chesapeake. But we needed to get the science right. We weren't trying to make it attainable out there. We were trying to determine what the Chesapeake actually needed as a system with 18 million people in it that could be sustained out there. So that, again, a tremendous amount, but you also notice the numbers vary because of the life cycle, a history that there, the types of effects that we're looking for survival down in worms and clams, but we're also concerned about behavior when you're in a migratory spawning rockfish or shad up there as well. So again, a tremendous amount of science, but done collectively across the partnership. Water clarity, again, a whole history over a decadal time period, or 2 decades, that looked at conceptual models, looked at mapping of grasses, looking at historical work that Bob Worth and his team at VIMS was able to look historically back in the 30s and 50s and 60s to where those grasses were. We did for the first time, we defined a water clarity criteria. We also defined an acreage goal that is actually in state standards, again, nowhere across the country other than Tampa Bay do they actually have a biological standard that are driving, whether it's wastewater treatment plants out in West Virginia or what we're asking for farmers up in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, driven by our 26 species of underwater grasses out there as well. And there's a science behind criteria assessment. One would think, hey, go out there, dip a bucket, take a sample, is it meeting or not meeting? Think of a 3-dimensional Chesapeake Bay with the 4th dimension being time. We had to define time and space, a volume of water out there because you have a system, and through time, a summertime period or a spawning period as well. And we had to get the statisticians in there because we needed to map this huge Chesapeake Bay and have confidence in there. Because again, billions of dollars were spent on, am I making it in this system? How much further I have to go? So there was a tremendous amount of science in there, but we had to boil it down to, is it attaining or not? But we had to make it so that somebody in Richmond would come up the exact same number if somebody in Albany or an advocacy group in Annapolis looked at the same set of data. Because we wanted to take that professional judgment out of there. Because, as I said, these are hundreds of thousands to $1 billion of decisions out there. And we needed New York, West Virginia, Pennsylvania bought in entirely, since they didn't have 1 meter of shoreline out there. but we were asking a lot from their farmers, from their local communities as well. And we took that science, those criteria, those designated uses, put them into the partnership's 92 segmentation of the Chesapeake Bay, and when you add them all up, we have around 273 designated use by criteria, by segment, places that we need to measure and look at whether it's healthy or not. And that was all then driving on your left-hand side. Those are the 92 segments, or 92 watersheds that flow directly into one of our 92 areas out there. That was the basis of the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, total maximum daily load, or quoting the folks out in Shenandoah, take mom and dad's land. Folks were taking this pretty seriously. You had to have good science because people were thinking that we were out there to take chicken farmers out of the eastern shore. I mean, out of the Shenandoah. We said, absolutely not. But Muddy Creek and the South Fork of the Shenandoah were impaired. That was impacting their grandkids' ability to enjoy those streams. We needed to have them have the confidence, as well as folks working the waters and the Potomac, that we knew what the science was, what was a healthy Chesapeake Bay, and what did we need to get out of those 92 watersheds across the bay system as well. That was where it sort of draw together. And though Gary Schenk will tell you that the models are more important, I would say that the end result was this thing that says meet water quality standards, yes or no. We have a tremendous amount, and you're going to hear more about it. We have world-class models, absolutely, no doubt about it. They help us think the decisions, but in this particular case we had a collective agreement between 6 states and the district, and I can tell you in the past 15 years since those went in place, there's not been one lawsuit questioning those numbers. There are folks that fight years or decades over water rights, over clean whatever. We haven't had those discussions and issues in the Chesapeake. We've had discussions and lawsuits over who has to do what, but not over clean water in terms of what it is out there. That is a testament to this solid science and the amount of people we had building these up over time. So we work these inputs all the way through, and the bottom line comes in for those areas that I showed you, for those 92 segments. For each one of them, again, they have an open water, deep channel. They might have a migratory spawning and nursery. They might have a shallow water. Did we meet water quality standards in that? That was a tough question to ask models. You had to be pretty precise. You had to be in the Magathy. You had to be in the Piankatank and the Chickawacomico and have a lot of confidence at that scale, not just the mighty Potomac or the York, the Rappahannock, to then say, was there enough light in 2 meters or less? Did we have algae in the James River that was meeting what we think is healthy out there? And I'm going to turn to the modeling system. So you had to have that evolving over time. So people had the confidence that said, if I'm going to ask you to take these actions in these watersheds, then I think you're going to get not only local water quality conditions, but we're going to meet the regulatory responsibilities under the Clean Water Act across all these segments here as well. And then one of the other things that you might see this chart a couple times, you'll see it a second time in my presentation, and this is how the science started to meld in with the policy, and I want to hit that a couple times. And that's, again, we deliver science not only to managers in our state, federal, local agencies, we deliver it right up to the cabinet secretary level. They don't get into all the models, et cetera, but we have forced in 3 day-long, and in one case in December, 2 days of meetings where we sat in front of policymakers from all 6 states, from environment, from planning departments, from natural resources, from the regulatory departments, and walked them through model results, information as well, along the following lines. So what you're seeing here is a span from what we call no action. If we pulled out all the BMPs across the Chesapeake Bay watershed, to an all forested situation, where we moved all 18 million of us and planted trees as we worked our way through there. Here's a span of which we've driven our models, and then the lines themselves are indications, the number of our segments out there that either for open water, deep channel, that were in violation, that they were not meeting, in this case, their dissolved oxygen needs. And then we did a series of scenarios to look for that sweet spot. Where do you get most or all of those 92 segments, plus all of their different designated uses under there meeting dissolved oxygen? And you notice where that blue arrow was where our cabinet secretaries and their federal counterparts and their Chesapeake Bay Commission colleagues agreed to that the Chesapeake needs about 195 million pounds of nitrogen and 13.7 million pounds of phosphorus. Doesn't need it, but that's what she can withstand, distributed across the 64,000 square miles, and meet water quality standards across the way there. You'll notice for the orange there, there was one segment that doesn't actually achieve it even at that particular place. So there was a recognition under our science, our modeling efforts, and others, that in fact we can't get there. You would need to drive the Chesapeake another 20 million pounds of nitrogen reduction more. We would figure another $4 to $6 billion worth of effort heading toward what we call E3, which is everyone, everywhere, taking everything possible out there, taking every treatment plant down to not close to distilled water, having every farmer, every municipality put every single practice on every square inch of land out there as well. We knew that that wasn't a possibility, but we're driving them pretty hard. So here the science was indicating that there are probably biological and human-caused reasons we can't get there. A partnership agreement, then we need to go back, in this case, modify Maryland's water quality standards to reflect that there are parts in the system, naturally and otherwise, that can't quite get there. So the policy and science also, in this case, in the final decision-making, are interconnected with each other as well. So next I wanted to walk you through a little bit of, seeing that we've described how do we define clean water out there using the science. I want to walk through the models and then try to wrap this all up together for you in terms of what we're learning through this collaborative decision-making process. What you'll notice in here, what I described, other than a very long sentence, which I'm known for, evolution of models driven by management needs. Not driven by the science, certainly taking the science, but driving those management needs, but then building in the scientific understanding as we go through. So there's times that the managers perhaps get a little bit ahead of the scientific community, vice versa. How do we keep that process moving forward with each other? But I hate to tell you guys, including Jim, you went way in the back there, you're back, you're in there. John Smith actually had it on the rest of us guys. So first, a couple things in here. You'll notice the word Virginia on here, you Marylanders and Pennsylvania folks. Right at the top, Virginia. John Smith actually envisioned the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed being part of Virginia. So you guys are actually in Pennsylvania and Maryland and part of Virginia, the Virginian Sea out there as well. So this is John Smith. He actually took the first crack at a segmentation scheme for the watershed model and water quality model. So Lou Linker, it took you guys a little bit long to figure out that secret map here was actually, he had a segmentation scheme for the phase 2 model already set up there in 1612. It was a Virginian product, so just give those guys a little bit of credit down there. So it took us a little while, maybe another 200, 300, 400 years in order to get there. So I want to talk you through a little bit of the history again of our a suite of models, one in the watershed, one in the estuary itself. But we've also got models looking at airsheds, we got models looking at land use and land cover over time. We've got models that look at oyster filter feeders in Menhaden. So in the case, if you look at the history of the watershed model, there was actually, quote, I know that we may not have called it back then, but a phase 0. You love modelers like the guys at Microsoft where they say, Windows 10.2.1. Well, these guys had to start putting the numbers out there that drove the management community crazy. But they eventually accepted that. But you look through that history, 1987, there was an early version of the watershed model actually that was built in the 70s and early 80s time period. We actually, our point there was, can we split point sources and non-point sources? We needed to, at the early parts of the partnership, of saying, how much is due to urban and ag compared to wastewater treatment plants out there as well? Then you keep moving in there, then there was a refinement of, oh my gosh, there's a lot more involved in urban stormwater and agriculture than we suspected. Let's continue to evolve our simulation over time. And then we started to, based on the 87 Chesapeake Bay Agreement, start to actually put a quantification on that, in fact, we've got to reduce our nitrogen out there. It was a 40% number. It was actually a 40% of a controllable fraction from only Maryland, Virginia, DC, and Pennsylvania. We didn't have New York. We didn't have West Virginia. We didn't have Delaware. We didn't recognize atmospheric deposition. Part of that was politics, and part of it was science. But we started the process going. So that 40% was really not a true 40%, because our scientific community was saying around 40 to 50% of a true reduction is what you need to do. Folks like Walter Boynton, Mike Kemp, and others were saying, guys, our early science was indicating you got to half it about from where we are now. And then over time, you'll notice our management goals say, okay, we need to start looking towards that progress of that 40%. And then in 2003, we said, hey, listen, we've got to start, we were allocating at very big scales. We need to actually start to go down to river basins. We need to recognize that Maryland and Virginia have subbasins. They have the York and the Rappahannock, but you need to start to go below that as well, and they started to evolve to that. 2010, the Chesapeake Bay TMDL came along. That was a big driver. and then more recently developing increasingly at a more local scale our phase 2 and phase 3 watershed implementation plans. And you can see along the bottom there, the coarse grid to a very refined grid, in this case in the watershed model, that reflected not just the history of how well you can capture and simulate hydrology and water flow out there, but it was also driven by, hey, if we're going to get this, we're going to go from this big scale to a smaller scale, that we've got to go from this broad definition non-point sources to a winter rye, corn, soybean rotation, and understand that at that particular scale. So we had to continue to refine this over time, driven by management needs, but also drawing heavily on the science. These models are hungry for that science. They want to draw it. They were based on calibration and verification or validation on hundreds of monitoring stations out there as well. But these were sort of the great opportunity to draw a huge amount of science. But as Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. In that case, he was talking about the Soviets. In this case, we were talking about the modelers. We love them. We actually let them out of their room occasionally across the watershed. But in fact, you had to verify it and calibrate it to the system out there. And the managers were always saying, hey, listen to us. We have different needs out there. You can see the same evolution on the estuarine model. I didn't put John Smith's 1612 version out there because he was way ahead of the modelers. But you can look at that coarse grid to one that you can hardly see in the back there in terms of the 2010 time period. That wasn't just because modelers said, hey, listen, isn't it cool? I can shrink my grid and make it look more like a Chesapeake Bay versus what Carl Serco, I mean, you got to wonder what Carl Serco dreams at night. You must dream in sort of this cubic fashion out there as well. But we eventually got him to the point where you could actually see the Chesapeake on his grid. It wasn't driven by that. It was driven by the needs to go to a much more finer scale out there, the set of questions, but also did the science support one we needed to have out there as well. But again, these were driven by, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and Don, you all at MCs and your colleagues at VIMS and ODU brought in millions of dollars at NSF and Sea Grant, et cetera, that drove understanding of the oxygen processes and the scientific pieces out there. Those were the underpinnings of how we could take this and have confidence in it. It was the scientific community looking at that next issue, that question, that still the calibration data still is some of the basic formulas under here that we, when you look under the hood, that's in there as well. It's that scientific community and how you all cut across not only institutions, but your disciplines to then bring the science necessary, particularly in the estuary, to make that moving forward. Hitting it one more time, and as you can see the phases of the model, phase 1 to phase 4 in this case, phase 5, and then phase 6. The early parts of the partnership, lots of agreements, still voluntary, still saying, hey, listen, we've got to get our feet under and the understanding of that. But eventually we got down to the point where, for our scientific and technical advisory committee stack and others were saying, hey, listen, there's enough science in here, we can go to the next level. And the policy folks were saying, we brought in Maryland, we brought in West Virginia, New York, and Delaware into the partnership in the 2000 time period. And we started then to say, hey, listen, we're not removing these impaired waters off the Clean Water Act list. We've got to move towards a TMDL, but we've got to do it our way as well. And our models evolved to that. As you can see in the middle section with the Bay TMDL, the phases of that moving forward. But in the red section as well, periodically on there, we went back to the scientific community and said, hey, listen, we're about to embark on the next round. What should we do? We actually went to the farm community and we went to talk to them about building a better bay, in that bay model. And that was actually a workshop with folks in the agribusiness, the farm community, the conservation districts of saying, how should we simulate our agricultural system into the future? Because we knew we had to get their level of confidence. And now we're into the phase 6 version. And you'll notice this thing called CAST. We also knew that you couldn't be expected to have a plastic pocket protector and a PhD in order to run these models. We needed to get, particularly the watershed model, in the hands of folks. And Raleigh, to your credit and others, and you kept going back and saying, make it a community model. Make it something you could break apart, make it something that the community could grab a hold of to evolve over time, but also people could use. It took us a while. We got to multiple models. We got to that community charge to do that, as I'll show you in a minute. But we also knew that we had thousands of other users out there that had to make incremental decisions at the local scale, at the regional scale, in order to be successful. They couldn't depend on somebody in Annapolis to do it. They needed to be able to use the cloud the way that we're all now taking advantage of that technology and do it themselves as well. The other key thing is, the whole science of using models have evolved over time. There were our manager folks that would refer to the partnerships models as the black hole. Somebody even named an earlier version of the S-stream model as Bubba, because if Bubba came in the room, it took over the entire room and you couldn't have room for making decisions. But in this particular case, it has driven some huge billions and billions of dollars of decision making, both in the TMDL itself, but also in the development of these watershed implementation plans by each of the 7 jurisdictions that you see up there as well. It brought in the scientific underpinnings. It didn't make the decisions for those, but it helped organize our thoughts, take a look at what's coming through, and take that information into a form that we can talk about. What do I need to do here? If I take these set of actions, I make this policy, I pass that law, how is that going to help? I can tell you that last week, some of my colleagues were actually testifying in front of the Pennsylvania State Agriculture Committee. They were talking about an urban fertilizer bill, and one of the key questions that those senators had was, is Pennsylvania going to get credit for its urban, by this bill, if we change our formulation of nitrogen and phosphorus and fertilizer? We had modeling results, we had monitoring data to indicate that that was the case, and the partnership to capture it as well. So even in those forms, this suite of science, those models, et cetera, are helping form, even to this day, policy on laws and different actions at state, federal, and local scales as well. And we took it a step further in the Chesapeake, and that is we used a combination of our modeling systems, our monitoring data, and our accountability in terms of practices on the ground out there, laws that are passed, and financing, to actually essentially put into an oversight category our 6 states and our district partners in terms of how they're doing across the source sectors out there, and are they putting in the practices that are going to give clean water locally and downstream there as well. Again, models help us understand, are these practices, are they on track? Are they putting it in place? Do they have the necessary, if we take a law like I just described and say we put it in place, how much further is that going to get Pennsylvania on their urban one, where they're in this case in the red backstop category, because they haven't put the practices necessary in place at the level of trajectory that the partnership's expecting. So we've intertwined, again, the models don't tell us red, green, or otherwise, but it provides information to then say, hey, listen, are you holding up your end of the bargain to keep us moving forward here? And then again, the suite of models allowed our cabinet secretaries and our federal and Chesapeake Bay counterparts to make decisions about, hey, listen, do we need to adjust the responsibility across 6 states in the district, and eventually those partners looking at geographically and by source sector, do I do something different? And I have to give Gary Schenk a tremendous amount of time. If you ever really want to get fascinated, crawl into Gary's brain. See, here you have an economist and an engineer, and you model the two together. It's a scary place, but my God, there's some cool stuff that comes out of there. And that is one of the key questions that we had early on, and that is, how do you politically take this pie, and how do you divide it up among 6 states, that you keep the science, but you also factor some policy in here? And here's the latest version of that is, and put it pretty simply, and that is, there was an agreement in the TMDL, and we've held that since then, and that is, if a particular jurisdiction, if a part of the watershed, pound for pound, has more of an influence on shared Chesapeake Bay water quality, and that's in the main stem of the Potomac, they need to do more. Even if they're up in New York and they don't have a square, or a meter of shoreline out there, even if they're out in West Virginia or Delmarva. So we then looked at our collective science, in this case in our phase 6 watershed model, and said, if you're on the left-hand side, that's nitrogen, right-hand side is phosphorus. What that's showing is pound for pound, through some amazing set of statistics and stuff, and delivered in that system. If you're in a higher red area versus a cooler color, pound for pound, you have more of an influence on the Chesapeake Bay. So when you then put those artificial human boundaries, state boundaries on there, that says, hey, Pennsylvania, or if you're down in Lancaster County, pound for pound, you have a lot higher influence on the Chesapeake than if you're down in Norfolk or up into Lynchburg area in the James River. That doesn't mean the James in that light, almost salmon color down the bottom doesn't have to do anything. Absolutely. They have to do a small piece for the Chesapeake. They have to do a large piece for local James water quality in there. But this allowed us to then say, we're not going to evenly divide it up. We're not going to divide it up because we don't like Pennsylvania or we don't like Virginia or something like that. We're going to divide it up based on what the sciences indicate in our policy decisions. And it also indicated, as we looked at here, nitrogen was having more of an influence in the Chesapeake water quality conditions than phosphorus was. That caused consternation. That caused, wait a second, we got to adjust things along the way. Here was the science. with a little bit of policy, driving, and essentially we're still working out, and by July 9th we'll have the final set of decisions. But this essentially 95% science and about 5% policy at the end of trying to make these adjustments along the way. This allowed everybody to then say, they turned back and said, hey listen, if I'm up here in Oswego County, if I'm out in Mineral County out in West Virginia, if I'm down in Norfolk and stuff like that, I know what I've got the responsibility to do. I've got a tremendous amount of 30 plus years worth of science behind it, and I've got validation because I've got monitoring data to then see what's happening here as well. This was critical. This has prevented us from having that war of northern aggression. My family was from Virginia and stuff like that. You know, nothing like fighting between, do I have to do more or less? We put those issues, as I said, no disagreement on clean water. We've had very little disagreement about how to allocate. We've had disagreement about, are you doing enough for your share? That's the kind of discussions we want to have. So we've been able to, with the science and the evolution of these models over time, and keeping up with the evolution of the politics, and if you look at the scale there, this allowed us as well, for the first time, to get agreement to take these basin-wide numbers, not just to a state basin like the Potomac section of Virginia, but down to a local scale. Each state in the district are agreeing to take it down to a scale that makes sense for them. Could be a conservation district, could be a county, could be a small watershed, but we're taking the Bay TMDL, we're taking the Bay restoration to the scale that makes a difference. Because that's where Walmart decisions are made, that's where conservation decisions are made, that's where people work with people that are working the lands, farmers, where they're making wastewater treatment decisions out there as well. And we could do that because we have the confidence in the science. We tried it under phase 5, we didn't have the confidence in that. We do now. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But is it some of the best science and models around this world? I would guarantee that. Or I'd certainly, as you'll see some of the results over the next several days, I'd have a hard time seeing that. So now finishing up, here's the challenge. So for the managers, and some of these guys are new to it, and some of these gals have been working this for a while, they've always said, hey, always improve these models. We understand about that 5 to 7 year time period. It's time to go to phase whatever. And Gary and those guys keep saying phase 7. I said, shut up for a little while, guys. I just got to get them using phase 6. Hold on. Always improve, but never change. Always improve, do it, but don't make my numbers change. Because that drives politicians, that drives folks that are asking for the farming community and others crazy. Keep it simple. But when you're doing the farming community, we want you to do all 126 farming practices out there. So we want to do from New York down to that, from peanuts to grazing cows out there, because our farm community has to be bought in. And we want you to be sure that you're not only doing poultry, you're doing layers and what are those things, Chris? You know, pullets and stuff like that. I always thought it was just Tyson's chicken on there, so excuse me, whatever that guy's name is. Keep it simple, but include everything. Okay, we can do that. Scientists, same ideas, always improve, keep it simple. But they want to use my research. Get my paper in there, guys. Use this research out there so I can get highlight. Keep it simple, but use multiple models. We heard it from the community model group, we heard it from Stack and from others. So how do you bring these two things together to do it? That's where you go into Gary's brain. And then you add Gopal Bhatt in there from Penn State. Even though he's from Penn State, he's still a good guy. All right, guys, we love Penn State. But your football team, yeah. So these guys took it seriously, and I can still remember the day sitting across from Lou Linker and Gary Schenk, Gary laying out on, it wasn't a napkin, but something pretty dang close, because if you've ever read Gary's script, you can't decipher it, but he's a good modeler. Our models were getting increasingly complex. Every time we had a new process, every time we'd add another component in there, get complicated in there, we'd have to be like, John, like you back there, Chuck Breakbill, be a little, have your pocket protector in there. You know you're a GIS geographer guy, you still got complicated on the guy. They simplified the hell out of it. They simplified it to the point where I was challenged 2 years ago to describe the phase 6 watershed model in 3 slides. Guys, I need 2 slides to just give my title. I got it to the point where, in a very broad audience, 3 slides to describe it to the point people could understand it. Why? Because look what we did. In fact, let me bring that up here. We took that complicated piece, and there are still complications, obviously, but they broke it up so that you could pull out a certain section, and you could sit down with a Fairfax County supervisor and explain to her what's happening in her urban system, and is she getting credit for this, and are what they're seeing in their local difficult run, is it being captured? And we said that, yes ma'am it is. You capture it in terms of understanding the load, the inputs, the sensitivity. This is not us being sensitive to each other. This is how these loads respond to what's happening on land. Land uses we could do, BMPs. We've had a 20, 30-year history of trying to capture those as well. Capture the land and water, the stream delivery, and river delivery, and you're done. We took that mystical piece, that black box, and we got it to a point where you could simplify it, you could explain it, and you could break it apart, which we've been doing, because sometimes you get results, you go, what the blank's going on there? And you could take a look at those different elements of that, and you could sit there and explain to cabinet secretaries and to conservation district groups and others and say, here's what we think is happening here. And we simplified it so you can bring it up on your desktop and you can run the same models and have the same exact answer that we've got up here as well. We had to make that breakthrough because we knew there were thousands and thousands of users. We got about 1,000 users of what we call the cash tool. I'm an old guy, so I remember McDonald's when there were 1 million sold. Mark, you remember that. You know, you and I went by that McDonald's back there in the 80s. Well, now they're at the billions and billions. I want to see 10,000 cast users in the next X amount of years out there. Then we know they have miniature Phase 6 watershed models on their laptops, their iPhones, their pads out there as well. But here's the manager's view. So we addressed it. They said, keep it simple, but include everything. They wanted to be sure that USDA and the farm community was out there, so we captured Apple and some of that. They understood the sparrow model, although they still understood, why would you name it for a really wacky little bird that runs around there? John, you got to explain it to me sometime. I know you got the acronym, but sparrow, couldn't you have made it hawk or falcon, something a little bit more exciting? Sparrow! What the hell? They wanted that included, they wanted these other pieces in there, so they were satisfied. I could explain it, they could see it, they could do it. Scientists, same thing. Use multiple models, guys. They built it in there. This was no longer HSPF because no one knows what Fortran is, Gary. I took Cobalt and Basic back then, man. He was the only guy that knew Fortran in our program. People kept saying, yeah, you need to code in R, X, Z, R. He kept saying, what? He's getting old, so that's okay. So that's why we hired younger models to do that work for us. Multiple models captured in there because you had the strengths. Something like phosphorus P, we had to go out there and get the best that we had out there. Why not bring it right into that simulation and capture it? Again, allow us to then break it up, keep it simple, keep it moving forward. Monitoring data, we're fortunate in the Phase 6 to have another decade worth of monitoring data. A little tough due to Peter Tango, Bruce Michael, and others. We added another 20 plus stations up in the watershed, but we added thousands and thousands and thousands of new monitoring data across there. Again, we've got a network that I'll trust a sample taken on just above Corning, down to a sample out in the cow pasture in Virginia, and compare those two directly from a laboratory, from a field collection standpoint. These things are integrated across the board there. Nowhere else in the country do I think, across the 6-state watershed, thousands of samples at hundreds of stations done as a unified network. Due to Peter Claggett and our USGS colleagues and Claire and others across the watershed, we took a 30-meter resolution and we mapped the entire 64,000 square miles at a meter resolution. We started to get down where it didn't look like Lego blocks, but you could actually see people's backyards and their driveways. People were concerned that we were going to actually start mapping out, do they actually have a pavers in the back? We said, hell no, guys. We'll just include that as an impervious surface. So we did that. We also were able to bring in local land use data and stuff like that. So the credibility all of a sudden went up. We had zoning data in there for hundreds of municipalities out there. We got it local to the point where people were buying into what was there because they could see the landscape out there. And now all these maps are essentially accessible by our partners, and we're planning to continue on a 3 to 4 year basis, updating this so that we will have a continuous wall-to-wall mappage at a 1 meter resolution, as well as LiDAR data into the future as well. So wrapping up here, what we went through on the Phase 6 models was different actually than what we did before. And that is because we knew we needed to get more of the scientific community, but we also needed local elected officials and others built in there as well. So that the Phase 6 suite of models, watershed, estuarine, airshed, filter feeders, 5 years in development, calibration, approval, and I'm going to show you all the partners in a minute. We use STAC. Bill Ball, I exhausted your team entirely because we convened workshop after workshop looking at the ag sector, at Conowingo, at climate change. We wanted the scientific community bought into that, and we also wanted the management community agreed to that. We had 26 different BMP panels. We have over 400 practices, from stream restoration to street sweeping, that the partnership has agreed not only a definition of that practice, what is nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment efficiency, but how it gets recorded out there, how it gets tracked, how it gets verified out there as well. We had 4 different beta versions. These guys took a little book out of Bill Gates' piece and put out beta versions so that the partnership actually had a chance for the first time to actually look at the inner workings of it, work it through. We actually had, again, through staff, peer review. They looked at every single one of our models. They looked at every one of our decision support tools, including our work with our USGS partners. And Rebecca, thank you for all your work on that as well, on looking at our statistical trend analysis methodologies as well. We had a fatal flaw one out there, and then eventually we had cabinet secretaries agree to the suite of models that they're ready for management application. The reason we did that is we wanted their fingerprints on it, so when they were making decisions, they agreed with the tools, how they would be used, what the limitations were, and how they wanted to proceed forward. And then finally, given our management structure out here, what I've got circled here is, here's all the groups. There were literally hundreds and hundreds of people for every single decision on our suite of models, much of the chagrin of my colleagues in our Annapolis Partnership Office. It had to be agreed to by a work group, a panel, eventually, in some cases, the principal staff committee, our cabinet secretaries. But whether, I also took our models to our advisory committees at the local government, citizen advisory staff. Not they were sitting there in the citizens advisory, but they were helping us think about how does BMP verification fit in here? Or in the case of local governments, does this make sense from a land use perspective and how we engage the localities out there? In our work groups across, so you can see water quality, but also folks in the fisheries and the habitat side, and then our staff scientific and technical reporting group led in part by Mark and Scott out here as well. So a tremendous amount of fingerprints on this as well. If you get tired tonight, you can go on www.chesapeakebaymodels. Whatever it is, calibration. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of calibration plots for every station that's in the tidal waters and out there as well. And Gopal Bhatt can actually recite all the statistics, whether you're looking at Sequoia Creek or something down on the Appomattox. There's my favorite, the Susquehanna, so you can look for your statistics in there. But folks, here's the thing of beauty. This is model output from the Watershed model at Conowingo Dam compared to WRTDS. And I'm not going to talk you through that one because that's a USGS term. Whoever invented Sparrow and invented the terminology for WRT. It's essentially a flow correction version of those two. But look how, you can't tell which one's model, which one's monitoring data. That's on an annual basis, and that's on a monthly basis. This is 100-year droughts, 100-year storm events out there, another 100-year storm, another. Bruce, you and I must have seen 5 or 6 of them. We're feeling pretty damn old out here. You guys at USGS have got to explain to us 100-year storms. We've had so many of them. But seriously, the comparison of the two, is it perfect? Absolutely not. But the fact that we can, whether it's on this one or some small watershed that's only capturing 200 square miles out there, the calibration of this model is incredible for what we got. And the same thing in the estuarine system, that we're nailing those DO issues, that we're nailing those systems out there as well. So in final here, 3 lessons learned from that. That our Bay agreements from 1980 through all the way through, as they increase their complexity, they increase the complexity of the management response. From a simple document, essentially saying we're going to hold hands together and work together in 1983, to the most recent one that brings in diversity, that brings in education for kids, that brings in detailed responsibilities for water quality, how we're going to do fisheries out there, all those elements as well. They keep raising the bar out there. That increased complexity in management drives a need for the latest science. So those management agreements, those agreements that tie us together, draw the science in there. That latest science then gets ahead of that and says, hey, listen guys, here's a set of issues you all hadn't thought about. We need to then pick that up in the next agreement. And what you saw through time is that process, every 5 to 7 years, the reopening of an agreement, the bringing in the new science, new complexity in the management community working with the scientific community saying, here's the next set of issues, and adapting as we go through the process as well. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. We have time for a couple of questions or comments from the audience. If anybody has anything they want to ask Rich. Yes, we have a question. You have to speak up.
You mentioned early on there in the original be a part of the bay that would not be able to be extended from what,
Yeah, actually, what it referred to as a part of the Chesapeake called what we call CB4, which is between the Bay Bridge and Patuxent. And in this case, in the deepest portion of that system, it was essentially determined that 100% of the time in that portion of Maryland waters, but it's not just Maryland, it's essentially most of the Chesapeake Bay influences, the Bay watershed influences that a certain small percent of the time we would not meet a 1 milligram per liter instantaneous minimum. So it's not saying that things are going to be dead down there. It was a small percent of the time that we couldn't get down there and continue to attain a 1 milligram per liter. The way we worked it is, we worked with Maryland, and I see getting all 6 states in the district to agree, and that is what we call a restoration variance. So Maryland's water quality standards recognizes the science that's up there that says, hey, listen, for a small percentage of the time, we can't get 1 milligram per liter in that area, but essentially politically and scientifically, we think it's justified, and it goes through a public review process and a regulatory approval process. Again, a very unique piece, because again, previously we had Maryland, Virginia, 2 different standards. We all agreed to that. We're pushing the system, but we found very small places for a limited amount of time that we couldn't get there all the way. We wanted to recognize that versus keep blind to it and say, oh, ignore it. Absolutely not. We wanted to be transparent about that particular process as well.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question. Larry?
Rich, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. One of the things that struck me, just watching your presentation and also thinking about it lately, is that the third leg of this whole thing that makes the Chesapeake so special is advocacy groups.
Mm-hmm.
It's how important public perception and public support and political pressure is to this whole system.
Absolutely.
What really stood out is the Bay Foundation started before any of this started, right? So that public pressure was important. And the TMDL wouldn't have happened unless Bay Foundation sued the EPA, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it's not all partnership. There's a certain amount of political pressure and adversarial relationship that's important to this whole process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Partnership doesn't mean hunky-dory, kumbaya around the table. Absolutely not. But you're right. I think over time we built a bigger and bigger tent. And if you looked at that fine print slide that I have, you would actually see some advocacy groups. You'd actually see some regulated community folks out there. We built that tent even when we were dealing with the science of criteria, because we wanted those positions in there to have that battle inside the tent versus outside the tent. But you're right. That public pressure, and it's not just the Bay Foundation, but we're fortunate to have hundreds of watershed organizations and other groups, and we also have a lot of national ones in DC. But the kind of work that Bill, that you've led with the report cards and others, that's catching out there, that there's that accountability. And I've watched the James River Association and their counterparts in the Potomac start to get into a battle of, is my report card going to get better than yours? That's the kind of competition we want. But the science underlies those, and that accountability is up there, so that my colleagues in West Virginia know how they're being graded for their Sleepy Creek and when compared to somebody on the Eastern Shore as well. But you're right, Larry. Having that advocacy and having that an integral part of that partnership has been important. That you're not just inviting your friends, you're inviting everybody under there to help. But you're doing it in a collaborative way. In a lot of cases, you're doing it in a consensus way as well.
Rich deserves a standing ovation.
Yes. Okay, absolutely. Thank you, Rick. We're going to miss you.